All right, get ready to dive into a story with a little bit of everything. Spirituality, controversy, accusations of cult-like practices, and even a link to multi-level marketing.
Wow.
We're going deep into the life of Chris Butler, also known as Siddhaswarupananda Paramahamsa,
Okay.
and the concept of sannyasa in Hinduism.
Yeah, this is a fascinating one. Butler's life story really makes you think about the ideals of sannyasa, this ancient tradition of renunciation and how they bump up against things like power, wealth, and influence in the modern world.
I'm interested already.
Yeah.
So, who exactly is Chris Butler?
Yeah.
How does he fit into Hinduism?
Well, he's the founder of the Science of Identity Foundation, or SIF, and he's got a pretty complex history with the Hare Krishna movement. Initially, he was involved with ISKCON, the International Society for Krishna Consciousness,
Okay.
but then he formed his own organization with a unique take on Bhakti Yoga, the path of devotion.
So there's a little bit of a rebellious streak there already, breaking away from such a well-established group. But before we get into all the controversies surrounding Butler and his organization,
Sure.
let's take a step back and really understand what sannyasa is. You mentioned it's an ancient tradition of renunciation, but what does that actually mean?
So it's actually a stage of life in Hinduism where someone decides to renounce worldly pursuits and dedicate themselves completely to spiritual liberation. Think about stripping away all attachments to material possessions, social status, even close relationships. The sannyasin's focus is only on seeking a deeper understanding of the self and the divine.
Wow, that's a pretty big commitment. Kind of sounds like becoming a monk in other traditions.
Yeah.
How does this idea of sannyasa fit into Hinduism as a whole? Is it something that everyone is expected to do?
That's where Varnashrama Dharma comes in. Think of it as a blueprint for living a fulfilling life,
Okay.
outlining 4 stages of life
Right.
and 4 social classes in Hindu society. Each stage has its own duties and responsibilities, contributing to the overall harmony of the individual and the community.
Okay, break it down for me. What are these 4 stages?
So it starts with brahmacharya, the student phase. It's all about learning, absorbing knowledge, and developing discipline. It's like laying the foundation for a life of purpose.
So, like focusing on education and self-development.
Exactly.
Makes sense. What comes after that?
Next is grihastha, the householder stage. This is probably the stage that most people are familiar with. You're focused on family, career, building a home, contributing to society, fulfilling your worldly duties and responsibilities.
Ah, yes, the joys and challenges of everyday life. So then I guess the next stage is all about winding down.
Yeah, you got it. Vanaprastha is the retirement stage, a time for gradual withdrawal from worldly affairs. You start to detach from material pursuits, you reflect on life's experiences, and you prepare for the final stage.
So it's like a transition period,
Yes.
a stepping stone to something bigger. Which brings us to sannyasa.
Exactly. Sannyasa is the culmination of this whole journey, the stage of complete renunciation. The sannyasin has fulfilled their worldly duties and is now free to devote themselves entirely to spiritual liberation. It's a life of deep introspection, meditation, studying scriptures, and sometimes even service to others.
That's a powerful concept. So you're essentially moving from a life focused on the outside world to one focused on internal exploration and spiritual growth. But are there different types of sannyasa? Do all sannyasins live the exact same lifestyle?
That's a great question. And it gets to the nuance of this ancient tradition. You see, within sannyasa, there's actually a range of practices and levels of renunciation. Some sannyasins choose to live totally isolated lives, meditating in caves or wandering from place to place, utterly detached from society.
Wow, that sounds super austere. Are there less extreme paths within sannyasa?
Oh, for sure. Some sannyasins choose to live in ashrams or spiritual communities,
Okay.
dedicating themselves to service and teaching. They might still interact with the world, but their primary focus is on spiritual pursuits.
So there's like a variety of expressions within sannyasa, each tailored to an individual's path and their capabilities. But those underlying principles stay the same.
Yeah.
Detachment, self-realization, and service to a higher purpose.
Exactly. It's really interesting to see how this ancient tradition has lasted and adapted over centuries, offering this framework for spiritual growth and liberation.
So now that we understand sannyasa a little better,
Right.
how does Chris Butler's story, with its contradictions and controversies, fit into all of this? That's what I'm really eager to unpack.
Well, that's where things get really interesting, because Butler claims to embody these principles of sannyasa,
Right.
but the accusations against him and his organization paint a very different picture.
Okay, let's dive into that. What are some of the specific accusations against Butler, and how do they clash with the ideals of sannyasa that we've been talking about?
One of the biggest accusations is that Butler has accumulated a ton of wealth through Sif, living a life of luxury, while his followers are expected to live modestly and donate generously. This, of course, goes against the sannyasin's principle of detachment from material possessions.
Yeah, this seems like a pretty stark contrast. A sannyasin renouncing wealth versus a spiritual leader accumulating it.
Exactly. And it's not just about money. There are also accusations of Butler controlling his followers' lives, dictating everything from their careers to their relationships. This seems to contradict the sannyasin's emphasis on personal spiritual development and the individual's unique journey towards the divine.
Wait, are you saying that sannyasins should avoid any kind of influence or leadership?
Oh, no, I don't mean that. I thought
God.
they were often seen as guides and teachers. Yeah, that's a really important point. While sannyasins are definitely respected for their wisdom and insights,
Right.
the idea is that they guide by example,
Okay.
not by dictating choices or exerting control. The goal is to help people grow and discover themselves, not to create a system of obedience and dependency.
Okay, I see the distinction. It's about empowering others to find their own path, not imposing your will upon them.
Right.
But I got to be honest, I'm still trying to figure out how these accusations fit with the fact that Butler has a lot of devoted followers who speak really positively about their experiences in Seth. How do we make sense of such different perspectives?
Well, that's where the complexities of human nature, faith, and spiritual seeking come in. It reminds us that even within groups that focus on love, compassion, and self-improvement, there's always the potential for things to go off track. So we've talked about how there are some serious questions around Chris Butler and whether his actions match up with the principles of sannyasa. But then there's this whole other layer with the QNet connection.
Right. The multi-level marketing aspect definitely adds another twist. I'm honestly still not totally clear on how it all fits together.
Okay.
Can you remind me what QNet is and how it connects to Chris Butler and Saf?
Sure. QNet is a multi-level marketing company, or MLM, that's worldwide. And these types of companies often have a pyramid structure where members earn commissions both by selling products and by recruiting new members into their network.
Okay, so that's MLM in a nutshell. But how does this global company connect back to Chris Butler and a spiritual organization like SIF?
Well, one of QNet's leaders, a man named Joseph Bismarck, who also goes by Japadas, is actually a disciple of Chris Butler.
Hold on, so a high-ranking person in a global MLM company is a follower of Butler. That's a pretty big link. I can see why this raises some red flags.
Yeah, definitely. And it's led to concerns about SIF's involvement in QNS operations, especially with all the controversies surrounding MLMs.
You mentioned controversies, like what kind of issues are we talking about?
QNet has faced some serious accusations, things like allegations of running pyramid schemes, using deceptive marketing tactics, and causing financial harm to its members. They've even had legal trouble in some countries.
Okay, so we've got these allegations of controlling behavior within SIF, Butler living this lavish lifestyle that seems to clash with sannyasa,
Right.
and now a connection to this controversial MLM company. This is a lot to process.
It is. And it's even more complicated because some people report positive experiences with both SIF and QNet. They talk about finding community, purpose, and financial success. So it's not a clear-cut situation.
It's almost like there are two different realities here. One where Butler is this spiritual leader guiding his followers to enlightenment,
Right.
and another where there are these allegations of manipulation, exploitation, and shady financial practices.
That's the challenge, isn't it? Trying to understand these seemingly contradictory stories. It shows how human motivations are complex and how, even in spiritual settings, things aren't always as they appear.
So where do we go from here? How can we make sense of Chris Butler and his legacy?
Well, I think it starts by realizing there's no simple answer. You have devoted followers who say Butler changed their lives for the better. But then you have those who claim they were harmed by his teachings and SIF's practices.
You know what? I'm starting to think that maybe the point isn't about making a final judgment about Butler or Seth. Maybe it's more about wrestling with these complexities, recognizing the different viewpoints, and using this story as a way to look at our own beliefs about spirituality, leadership, and the search for truth.
I think you've hit on something really important. This deep dive isn't just about Chris Butler. It's about the bigger questions it raises, like, how do we tell the difference between real spiritual leadership and potentially harmful practices? How do we figure out those gray areas where good intentions might overlap with questionable actions? These are questions we all need to be asking, especially nowadays when information, belief systems, and spiritual paths are so easily accessible and often mixed together.
It makes me think about how important critical thinking is,
Yes.
especially when it comes to faith and spirituality. It's so easy to get caught up in the charisma of a leader or the feeling of belonging that a group offers.
You're absolutely right. We can't just blindly accept teachings or follow leaders without questioning, without looking at the evidence, and without trusting our own intuition.
You know, it's interesting. Earlier, we were talking about sannyasa as this old path of renunciation and spiritual liberation.
Right.
And now we're talking about the possibility of manipulation and exploitation within spiritual organizations. It feels like a total contradiction.
It does, right. But maybe that's the whole point. Maybe Chris Butler and Sif's story is like a warning. It reminds us that even in what seem like sacred traditions,
Yeah.
you can still have human error, ego, and the abuse of power.
This whole deep dive has definitely made me reconsider what I thought about spiritual leadership and the dynamics in religious groups. It's clear that we need to be careful,
For sure.
ask the tough questions, and be aware of the potential for harm, even in places that say they offer enlightenment and salvation.
I think that's a really important takeaway. And as we wrap up this exploration of Chris Butler and the idea of sannyasa, it's worth thinking about this. Can someone truly live by the ideals of renunciation and spiritual liberation
Right.
while at the same time holding power, accumulating wealth, and controlling others?
That's something each listener will have to think about for themselves.
Yeah.
Based on what we've talked about and their own understanding of spiritual principles. There's no easy answer, and maybe that's the biggest lesson of all.
You know, it's really interesting how this deep dive has gone from these ancient and deeply respected spiritual concepts to the really complicated stuff in modern life, where spirituality often mixes with things like wealth and power and influence.
Right.
Makes you think about how tough it is to stick to those basic principles in a world that can be so focused on material things and ambition.
Yeah, what strikes me is how Chris Butler's story shows this struggle between the ideal to sannyasa and the appeal of success in the world. Like, it makes us wonder if you can really embrace a path of renunciation.
While also building up wealth and influence at the same time.
And that's the big question I keep coming back to. Can you actually balance those two things?
Yeah.
Can someone truly live a life of detachment and spiritual liberation while also being this charismatic leader, a wealthy figure, and maybe even a controversial person?
It's a question that goes beyond just Chris Butler. It speaks to a wider issue in a lot of spiritual traditions. How do we deal with leadership, power dynamics, and the potential for abuse, even within groups that say they're all about love, compassion, and enlightenment?
I think this whole deep dive has been a powerful reminder that we can't just accept things as they seem, especially when it comes to faith and spirituality. We've got to be critical thinkers, ask the tough questions, and be ready to challenge what we believe.
Absolutely. Blind faith can be risky. We have to be discerning, look beyond the surface, and consider different perspectives before we make judgments or put our trust in any person or organization.
You know, at the beginning of this deep dive, I was so curious about Chris Butler and all the controversy around him. But now I find myself thinking more about what this story means on a larger scale. It's made me think about why people search for spirituality, the pull of charismatic leaders, and how important it is to stay true to our own values and intuition.
Yeah, I think that's a really valuable shift in how you're looking at this. This wasn't just about figuring out Chris Butler and Sif. It was about using this story to help us look inward and understand more deeply how complicated spirituality can be in the modern world.
So as we wrap up this whole exploration of Chris Butler's sannyasa and the surprising connection to multi-level marketing, what are some key takeaways that you hope our listeners will think about?
Well, for me, it's about understanding that the path to spiritual growth isn't always clear or easy. There will be bumps in the road, contradictions, and times when we need to question everything, even the people we see as spiritual authorities.
It's also a reminder that critical thinking is super important, especially with faith and spirituality. We need to be smart about the information we take in, be careful about blind faith, and always trust that inner voice we have.
Yeah, at the end of the day, spiritual growth is a deeply personal journey. There's no one right way to do it, and what works for one person might not work for someone else. The key is to stay curious, keep learning, and be open to new ideas while staying true to your own values.
This has been a really insightful deep dive, and I hope our listeners found it as interesting and thought-provoking as we did. And remember, the journey of understanding doesn't end here. Keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep searching for those deeper truths that speak to your own heart and mind.